And I would especially like to thank Union College for co-hosting this event with us. This is part of the celebration of the 150th anniversary of the Dudley Observatory, and we'll be celebrating with a gala tomorrow night at the Albany Institute of History and Art. And if any of you are interested in attending that, we have some information available at the back desk, and one of the highlights of it, besides that it will be a whole lot of fun, is that there is a painting of the inauguration of the Dudley Observatory in the Albany Institute of History and Art. And as part of the evening, we will be doing a remake. And anybody who comes will be immortalized in the collection of the Albany Institute. So besides that, we have great prizes and fabulous people, and it's going to be fun. So anyway, there's more information on that in the back if you'd like it. Another thing I'd like to bring to your attention for afterwards is that Dudley Observatory has a fabulous collection of rare books. And among them there's a first edition Copernicus and some books by Galileo that we've brought out for the evening that they'll be on display just for this evening. So after the lecture, if you'd like to take a look at the books, and then Dava Sobel will be signing books, and there will be a reception, and that's all at the end. So now for the beginning. Dudley Observatory has played really three main facets right now. One is the history of astronomy, and we've asked Dava Sobel to be one of the honorary chairs for our gala tomorrow night, because she's done such a tremendous job making the history of astronomy accessible and enticing. We will also have Assemblymember Jack McEnany, I guess I should say, the three facets of Dudley Observatory that we're highlighting are that its role in the history of astronomy, science education, and astronomy education, and the history of Albany. And Jack McEnany, as many of you know, has written the book on the history of Albany and loves that. So he will be an honorary chair representing that. And then Dr. Shirley Jackson, whom we all know from the president of RPI, has done an amazing job publicizing RPI and science education. So anyway. So for tonight, we've invited Dava Sobel to give a talk, and many of you are familiar with her works, especially probably Galileo's Daughter, Longitude, and the Planets. And she's received many awards for her continuing and successful efforts to instill an understanding and appreciation of science in the public. Among these are the Individual Public Service Award from the National Science Board, Boston Museum of Science's Bradford Washburn Award, and the Harrison Medal from the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers. And for those of you who are not familiar with that, I checked out on their website. They were founded in 1631 to regulate and encourage the art and mystery of watch and clock making, together with many related skills such as engraving, sundial making, and mathematical instrument making. So there's one for everyone to try for. Ms. Sobel has 30 years' experience as a science journalist, having written for the New York Times, New Yorker, Life, Audubon, Discover, and having been a contributing editor to the Harvard Magazine and Omni. She has an amazing knack for bringing people and events in the history of science to life. She helps us visualize the effects of society, religion, illness, personality, weather, and all kinds of other things on scientific discoveries. Besides, whoever thought that longitude would be interesting, much less fascinating? So, I'm delighted to introduce Dava Sobel.
So, thank you for inviting me here to talk about two of my favorite people, Galileo and Copernicus. We were calling this evening When the Sun Stood Still, because I wanted to talk about that time in history that I keep going back to, when the universe really turned inside out. And I find that time wonderful, yeasty and wonderful, and a little bit like our time now, because our view of the solar system, I think, is changing now, maybe not as much as it did in the time of Galileo and Copernicus, but close. And we are witnessing the discovery of planets of other stars, and even the reorganization of our own solar system. New things being added, old familiar things being not really physically removed, but having their status changed. How many people are upset about what happened to Pluto? How many people are glad? How many people don't care? Yeah. Okay. Well, I have to admit to you, I was actually part of the preliminary committee, the Planet Definition Working Subgroup of the International Astronomical Union. And I was the only non-scientist on the committee, which was a daunting position. But we had an amazingly comfortable, easy time. We were 7 people, and we were charged with framing the definition of a planet that would be put before the general membership of the IAU for voting. And in our definition, Pluto would have stayed a planet, and a few other things would have become planets. But as you know, we were outvoted. So the only thing I regret about that is the public was made to think that the entire 10-day meeting in Prague was this game of semantics that was really meaningless, when of course it's not meaningless to try to arrive at the first scientific definition of a word that people have used for thousands of years. Now that there's really cause to have a meaning and a working definition of it. And there were, and of course many other things went on at the meeting in Prague. The planet definition was just a small part of it, but it was the part that everybody could understand, so it got the largest treatment. And in Galileo's day, it was much easier to say what a planet was, because it was just a wandering star. Nobody had any idea what planets were made of. And Galileo's real problem was in trying to insist that the Earth fit in that category, that it was not the motionless center of the universe, that in fact it was moving like the other planets and moving at a very rapid rate, which was of course the thing that got him into trouble. And even before he was brought to trial, there was an edict passed against this dangerous idea, in which the idea was judged not only heretical, but also foolish and absurd. So you can see why he had such trouble getting the idea across. But what's really interesting to me is why Galileo was at the focus of all this controversy. It wasn't even his idea. And the real reason he became the lightning rod for it was that he made discoveries that began to provide evidence for Copernicus's idea. He also wrote about his ideas in the popular language. He wrote in Italian. And this was seen as a very dangerous activity, that he was talking about these things to the uneducated masses and not just to his fellow academicians. So he was the Carl Sagan of his day, and that is really what got him into trouble. Copernicus had no evidence, and in fact Galileo is on record as having said that he admired Copernicus all the more for sticking to the idea, even though he had no tangible evidence whatever. So you might wonder what convinced Copernicus. And that's a really good question because he doesn't really say. And yet, he was convinced that he had actually uncovered the true architecture of the universe. And at his time, that was a remarkable claim because no other mathematician was claiming such a thing. Whatever system was put forward just as a model, as a way of calculating planetary positions, and mostly predicting them so that you could cast horoscopes, which was the major use of astronomy in that period. I often get criticized for having talked about astrology in my book, The Planets. And at the time, I worried about doing it too because Carl Sagan was a mentor to me, and he spent most of his professional life trying to get people to agree that astrology was bunk, and that if you wanted to understand your connection to the universe, you should study astronomy and realize that you're made of stardust, which is true. Nevertheless, how many of you know your sign? Come on now. Okay, so I felt if you're addressing people who don't know anything about the planets and want to give them a way into the subject, would it make sense to leave out the largest area where they've learned the names of the planets? How many people think that Copernicus was afraid to publish his idea for fear that the church would have a negative reaction? I think, even though not everybody raised a hand, I think it's fair to say that that is the general belief. But Copernicus, I don't think, was at all worried about that. First of all, he was in the employ of the church. He was a canon, an administrator of church business. And his uncle had been the bishop of his diocese. And his great book, De Revolutionibus, a copy of which is right here for you to look at later. It's open to the page with his wonderful diagram, a simplified diagram. That book is dedicated to the Pope. So it doesn't look to me as though he was afraid of the church's reaction. The Pope at that time was Paul III, who is the Pope who excommunicated Henry VIII. And Copernicus himself was actually threatened with excommunication, not by the Pope and not for anything having to do with his astronomy, but over the issue of his housekeeper. I'm serious. There were several cathedral canons who had female housekeepers. And in the early days of the Protestant Reformation, the church got very nervous about how it was perceived. And the idea that these bachelor canons would have unmarried women living in their homes became a scandal. And Copernicus was warned on a couple of occasions that he had better send this woman away. And on one of the occasions, the bishop threatened him with excommunication if he did not comply. I originally got interested in Copernicus' story by reading Arthur Koestler's book, The Sleepwalkers. I think that's a very well-known early history of astronomy. And he told this amazing story about how Copernicus got convinced to publish his book. And I've been interested in the idea ever since. And it's not the kind of story you could write a whole book about, because there's very little material about Copernicus. There are only 17 letters that he wrote that survive, and all but 2 of them are very short and just about church business, although 3 of them involved the housekeeper. Why? She left to get married, and he made a point of saying that she didn't have to get married. In other words, she was not pregnant. Then apparently she came back because her divorce is part of the church record. And so when she was asked to leave again, there's a letter about why he couldn't rush her away all that quickly. And then there's another letter. She was visiting the town and actually stayed at his house overnight, which really did not go over well with the bishop. But there aren't enough letters to hang a story on, and the most interesting aspects of his life are the unrecorded conversations, namely how he got talked into publishing this book. He had actually worked on the idea of the sun-centered cosmos his entire adult life. He'd put about 30 years of work into it. And then he was getting old. He just felt that he would be laughed at. He had worked to try to establish a real proof for the idea, and he knew he hadn't done that. And so he was just going to shelve the project. And just at that time, a young genius came to visit him, a Lutheran from Wittenberg, Martin Luther's own town, just arrived at his door and convinced him to take up the work again and to let him stay on as an assistant and help him get the book ready for publication. And when I first read this story in Kessler, I remember thinking, that must have been some conversation. And here they are, old and young, different religions. There was even an edict in Copernicus's town that Lutherans were not allowed to be there. And yet this young man was allowed to stay for more than 2 years. So how did that happen? What kind of a deal got brokered with the bishop to get permission for this? None of this is known. So if you're going to deal with this fascinating story and try to write it as a book, you'd constantly be trapped saying things like, it is likely that, or people think, or perhaps this and perhaps that. So much better to abandon the nonfiction stance and have at it in a fictional form so you can really explore these interesting questions. And I always thought it could be either a historical novel or a play. But really, since it's about conversation, it should be a play. And so I've carried this idea for a play about Copernicus around with me for decades now, too fearful to attempt it. But the nice thing about getting older is you get a little braver, and I like to do projects that are a real challenge. And I am certainly challenged to my maximum here because I want to tell you that writing a play is nothing like writing a book. And that might seem obvious, certainly seemed obvious to me at the beginning, but I had no idea how profoundly true it was. And in fact, I would say that my first 2 drafts of this play were actually books disguised in play form, so that the thematic subjects of the book were apportioned among the various characters, but it didn't get up and move the way a play needs to move. Copernicus's life is extraordinarily dramatic, so it really lends itself to a play. There's one aspect that's so dramatic that I hesitated to use it, even though it's true, and that is that Copernicus received the final pages of his book on the very day he died. So he never knew what the public reaction was to his book. And it isn't clear that he understood even what had happened to his own book in the printing of it. Another person who was inspired by Arthur Koestler is Owen Gingerich, who picked up on Kessler's insult to Copernicus. Kessler didn't really like anybody but Kepler, and he said that Copernicus's book was so dull that nobody read it, that in fact it was the book nobody read. So Owen Gingerich got interested in that concept, and the first copy of De Revolutionibus that he examined was filled with marginal notes. And he asked himself, if nobody read it, what are the odds that the first copy I looked at has not only been read but studied? So that set him off on a quest to track down all the extant copies of the first and second edition and see who wrote what in the margins. And it turned out that everybody had read it, that it was an extremely important book. So when Owen's book came out about 3 years ago, I bought the dramatic rights because I felt, now I'm really going to write this play, and I have his work to build on. And if I buy the dramatic rights, I could use his title. I loved the title, The Book Nobody Read. But then I got nervous that it would turn into the play nobody saw. And I looked around for a new title. I now have a title that I like very much and that Owen Gingerich thinks is better than The Book Nobody Read. And it's And the Sun Stood Still, because that is the crux of Copernicus's argument. But it is also the quote from the book of Joshua that was used against him when Galileo made Copernicus famous enough for his idea to be debated publicly. This was one of the quotations that the Holy Congregation of the Index seized on. You know, if the sun was standing still, why did Joshua have to tell it to stand still? So I started out my play project doing what I usually do, which is homework. And I read everything I could find about Copernicus, including a couple of translations of De Rev. And it is really rough going, especially if you don't have a strong math background. And then I discovered an interesting rule in drama, in historical drama. The fact that something actually happened is the least important reason for putting it in the play. Because a play is really about characters and who those characters are and what it is they want and what are their conflicts, what is standing in the way of their getting what they want. And then over the course of the play, they resolve those conflicts, and then the curtain comes down. It's not a history lecture, it's not an astronomy discussion, it's about these characters. And these characters are really terrific. I mean, you have Copernicus, not only is he an astronomical genius and an administrator in the church, he's also a medical doctor. He was personal physician to the bishop and the duke, and he was an economic theorist and recommended currency reform in Poland, all of which was enacted by the king. So, in fact, there's a term, Gresham's law in economics, about how bad currency drives good currency out of circulation. That law was actually formulated first by Copernicus, although he doesn't get credit for it. And then his young visitor, Rheticus, who was only 25, mathematical genius at Wittenberg, and a homosexual at a time when homosexuality was a crime punishable by burning. But he bravely comes to this foreign country where he's not even allowed to be and works on this. These two men form this unusual alliance and get this historical volume ready for the printer. And so now I get to wonder, what did they actually say? And what was the nature of their conflict? Certainly the first conflict was that Copernicus didn't want the book published, and Rheticus did. And what was his motivation? Why was it worth it to him to travel 200 miles to a country where he wasn't welcome? And it turns out that Rheticus was an avid astrologer, and his own horoscope actually predicted an early death. And I think that was a large part of his motivation, that with Copernicus's improved predictions, maybe he could move Saturn to a different house in his chart and have more to look forward to. Copernicus himself says nothing about astrology in any of his writings, which really makes him unique. I think that makes him even more unique than his idea about the structure of the universe. Because if he was a non-astrologer, it seems he was the only one. And how did he become convinced that he had figured out the order of things at a time when people believed that the only route to absolute knowledge was through divine revelation? Did he have a vision? What gave him this idea? It's often said that he actually copied the idea from Aristarchus, but I think it's likely that he didn't know about that. When he actually started writing his book, he, in his own dedication to the Pope, he talks about ancient references. But I think that was a PR gesture, because at that time, if you could find an ancient precedent for what you were saying, it made you look good. But I don't think he'd actually taken the idea. And even if he had, Aristarchus's text has never been found, so he couldn't have read anything about it, except there's a very brief mention of it in Archimedes, but just the idea that the sun is at the center and the earth moves around the sun. Copernicus's manuscript for this book survives to the present day, which is a remarkable thing. There are no manuscripts of Galileo's books. So how and why did that happen? And my personal opinion is that, having worked on this book for 30 years, when it came time to send it to the printer, he couldn't part with it and insisted that a copy be made. So he kept the original, and he continued to make changes in it even as the book was being printed. And I was able to get permission to see the manuscript, which is kept in Krakow now. And at the beginning of my work on this project, I asked a couple of people what was the likelihood of being allowed to see the manuscript. And everybody thought that likelihood was vanishingly small. And I almost gave up on it. But one of the amazing things about rare books and rare book collections is that people who have charge of them really do want to show them to people who are interested. And it's nothing you can buy. You just have to really be interested. And that's a beautiful thing. So I did get permission, and the book is kept in a temperature and humidity controlled safe. And when I arrived at the Jagiellonian Library to see it, I was taken into a room that had a small table with a white lace tablecloth. This is Poland. That's how things are done. But there was a little velvet rest for the book. And my first thought was, oh no, they think I want to see a first edition. That's the way the table would be set up for a first edition. Surely they aren't going to put the manuscript on that, but they did. And actually the curator held it in front of me, and I was not allowed to touch it. but she did page through it pretty carefully and showed me the pages of great interest, such as the pages with lots of crossing out or ink blots. And the best page of all is where he drew the diagram that you can see here. But his drawing of it is better because in his handwritten manuscript, he actually curved his text around the circles of the diagram. And the page has a hole at the center where right next to the word soul, because he used a pair of compasses to draw those 8 circles. And when I saw that hole, that was a defining moment. That's why it's always worth trying to see the real thing if you can do it, because he was right there. You know, the whole process became visible. So the great irony of his story is that this young man, after going through all this trouble to get the book, hand carry the manuscript to Nuremberg and take it to the best scientific printer in the world. And then he was supposed to stand over it and manage the printing and the proofreading. Well, somewhere near the end, he got offered a better job. And he left. And the proofreading fell into the hands of a Protestant minister who had been in correspondence with Copernicus and who had been on record as saying that he didn't think this thing should be presented as fact, that it should be presented as a maybe possibility. And he inserted a preface, a letter to the readers that offered this opinion. And in fact, I want to read you a little part of it. This is how it ends. Let no one expect anything certain from astronomy, lest he depart from this study a greater fool than when he entered it. So that's how Copernicus's book begins. That's the first thing you read. And I think, and it was an anonymous preface, so you might think, reading that Copernicus himself had written it. And that certainly colored the way people looked at that book. One question is, did Copernicus himself know that that had happened? That would have been in the pages that reached him on the day he died. So I would rather think he didn't know. He had suffered a stroke 5 months before and had been really failing just before the end. So probably he wasn't aware of it. But somehow he had stayed alive until he had the satisfaction of seeing that the book had actually been printed. So the reception, colored by this preface, people read it really, the astrologers loved it. Here were all this interesting idea that they could now look at just as a way of thinking about things, not as the real architecture of the universe. And a lot of those marginal notes that Owen Gingerich uncovered don't even appear in the early sections where he lays out this beautiful new vision of the heavens. The notes are more about how you do the math and make the predictions and make tables and figure out the best design of your horoscope. So fortunately for me, the Sloan Foundation is very interested in plays about science. So they have been generous to me on this project, and they've put me together with, they give grants to 4 theaters to encourage them to bring in plays about science. So I've been working with the Manhattan Theater Club, and they gave a reading this summer so I could hear it out loud. And it sounded really good, but then I'm a person who likes listening to books on tape. When I reviewed it seriously again after the reading, I thought, if the actors were trying to act it out as opposed to reading it aloud, I wouldn't have enjoyed it. So, but But I think it's almost there now. And of course, I'm hoping Manhattan Theater Club will decide to actually produce it. But I won't know that for another couple of months. And if that doesn't happen, then I think it could have a nice life in the college and university world, because it is a true story. Even though I've had to make things up for the sake of the play, I would certainly present it with all the background material, and it's a wonderfully interdisciplinary story. So there's that ahead of it. And now that I've got the playwriting bug, for lack of a better word, I would really like to try another. And I'm very interested in the Harvard College women who worked under Edward Pickering and were hired to make the calculations of the observations that the men took. And they were in a strange position because they were all extremely intelligent and were thrilled to have a job in an observatory, and yet they were at the very bottom rung, and they were paid about a quarter of what the men were paid for doing similar work. So it was a tense situation. And then some of them actually had interesting ideas about astronomy, which they tried to convince Pickering about, and he was not swayed. But needless to say, it's a dramatic situation, and I hope I will get a chance to try to make a play out of that. And what I would love to do now, with the rest of our time, is make this more of a back and forth. We're a nice small group. We could talk about Galileo and Copernicus, or longitude, or anything at all. Do you have questions? Yes?
Galileo's Daughter is one of my favorite books of all time.
Thank you.
I was interested in translating the letters. Were they in Latin or were they in Italian?
The question is about the letters in Galileo's Daughter. Were they in Latin or Italian? They're in Italian. And the Tuscan dialect has not changed much thanks to Dante. And so even though the Italian I studied in school was modern Italian, it was really not that hard to read it. What was difficult was the sentence structure, because this woman had an extraordinary grasp of the rhythm of language and wrote long sentences that would switch from mundane topics to considerations of the afterlife, and in a single sentence. And just following the course of thought through a sentence was difficult. And of course, there are lots of references to religious subjects that were new to me. And her handwriting would have posed a problem. But because these letters have been known and have been published with Galileo's complete works for 200 years, I was able to read them set in type. And then I went to see the real letters after I already knew what they said. And also she abbreviated almost every word. Part of that was she had no time, and part was just the convention, and also part was she had no paper. You know, they lived in poverty, and paper was expensive, so everything was abbreviated. And I think the Catholic part of it was the most challenging for me, having been raised Jewish in the Bronx. Learning about the Catholic faith, which was such a central element in this book, was much more complicated than any of Galileo's science. But I had lots of help. Yes?
Segue to my question.
Do I think Galileo and the Vatican are at peace today? No. No, I don't. And it's such a shame because you probably know Pope John Paul wanted peace. And he appointed a commission to restudy Galileo's case. And, you know, we're in an academic community here. You know what happens with committees. On this appointed committee, there were a few people who really worked hard and who met frequently and even published some of their deliberations. And then there were all the other people who didn't do anything. And I think 2 decades went by before one day the Pope said to one of his cardinals, "Whatever happened to my Galileo committee? Where is the report? I want to see something." So the word went out that the subcommittees all had to submit their final reports right away. And then this cardinal wrote his own summary, which did not really reflect the work of all the subcommittees. And that's what went to the Pope. And so his statement was a big waffle. I mean, he wound up saying things like, you know, the theologians hadn't really understood the theological issues, and Galileo hadn't really understood the scientific issues. And it was a bizarre thing, and it's a shame because people laughed at it. It backfired totally, I think. There were humorous songs written about it. There were editorials written, you know, who will they dig up next to forgive? And it became a joke, like the planet definition. And so the members of the hardworking subcommittee were devastated by what happened and have been working to see if something else could be done. You know, it's 400 years, it's still not settled, so I don't know what else will happen, but I don't think there's real peace. Yes?
Do Galileo's telescopes still exist? And if they do, who made them and where are they?
Do Galileo's telescopes still exist, and if so, who made them and where are they? At least one and probably 2 of his own handmade telescopes do still exist, and they are in Florence at the Museum of Science, Museum of the History of Science. And that museum has a wonderful website, and it allows you to actually go through the Galileo, well, lots of there, but you can go through the whole Galileo exhibit and look at each instrument one at a time. You can rotate it and really see it from every angle. I think it's imss.it, but it's just a Museum of the History of Science, Florence. If you do that on Google, you'll see it. And there's a couple today making replicas of Galileo's telescope, and they replicate the optics and the beauty of the gold and leather tooled covering on the cardboard tube. And the Griffith Observatory in LA has one of those replicas in their exhibit, and they're probably at other museums too, but I happen to have seen that one. And you know, the strange thing is that if you've got even a cheap pair of binoculars, you're doing better than Galileo did. And what he was able to achieve with his telescope is quite remarkable. Yes?
I think I heard you say that Copernicus was very knowledgeable in a wide range of fields. But I didn't hear you say much about what do you think his character was?
The question is, what do I think Copernicus's character was? Well, since you asked me what I think it was, that's how, because nobody really knows what he was like. He has been portrayed in novels. John Banville wrote a novel about him called Dr. Copernicus, in which he's an absolutely horrible character, dark and depressed and mean-spirited and just treats people in a vile way. I don't believe that at all. I mean, he was a doctor. He was a healer. And he was such a good doctor that he was called across distances to take care of things. Also, during the year, he spent about 3 years in a position where he had to record all the business of the diocese. And a lot of that business was the rental of the church lands to the peasants and who got how many sacks of grain. And his handling of these disputes, how he settled things, how he dealt fairly with these people, I think shows him as a very wise and kind individual. You know, not just brilliant, but wise in managing human affairs. And I think he was probably happy because he got to do what he really loved doing. And toward the end of his life, he felt that his work couldn't be published, and that must have been crushing for him. But I think up to that point, he loved his work. I mean, he did all 30 years worth of observation and thought and writing, and really had the solitude to devote to that kind of work. I think for an astronomer that was a form of heaven on earth. So I think he was happy most of his life, and I think he was a good person. Yes? I'm sorry, repeat the last part. Let me make sure I've understood your question. Since Copernicus did not think that the planets moved in elliptical paths, his calculations were not that much better than Ptolemy's in terms of predicting. And in fact, he was trying to show that his system was as good as Ptolemy, so he didn't want to be too different. But he did notice that there were problems in how the calendar was calculated, and how the more recent astronomers had come up with explanations that involved movements of planets faster at one point in their orbit than another. The strange thing about Copernicus, aside from all his modern kind of thought in terms of envisioning reality, is he actually believed in solid spheres. I mean, his math is all about preserving the motion of perfect circles. So is your question, is that what the marginalia is about, people trying to?
Yeah, I'm just imagining it's the way the scientific community works, right? Once you come up with a new theory, another scientist try to test that theory. So I'm picturing these scientists after Copernicus doing the calculations to try to see if it does better or worse than Ptolemy's model. Finally, it doesn't do much better, actually.
Yeah. But what his theory, yeah, it didn't do much better than Ptolemy, but his theory made a cohesive whole. And in Ptolemy's theory, there was no reason why planets went at this speed or that speed. He was able to show that when you arranged the planets around the sun, that their speeds diminished with distance. And he had no idea why that would be true, but it was a compelling discovery. And I think that's part of why he was convinced he was right. Yes?
So the follow-up is, some people think Copernicus actually was the person who made the system work, and Copernicus only went halfway, and really is
Yes, the question is, since Copernicus didn't really figure it out and didn't have a clear view of what the heavens looked like, but Kepler really brought Copernicus's system to maturity, where am I? I agree. Copernicus started something, and it took Kepler to carry it through. Even Galileo never bought the idea of ellipses, so it was Kepler who created the modern solar system that we have, and he didn't have Pluto either. Yes?
Speaking of Pluto, I have an observation and some are a question. I'm an actor, so I sometimes perform a musical version of Schoolhouse Rock. It has a song about the planets, but we can no longer do it.
Do it.
That's the observation. But it brings to mind thought about the apparent conflict anyway between what goes on in society and what happens in science. And at the heart of Galileo's life, well, I've got a lot that's going on. Do you think we're any better today at dealing with that conflict between science and society? Thinking about
Are we better today dealing with the conflict of science and society than...
conflict over evolution, cell research and morality, those kinds of issues that touch us all.
Well, first let me say that I don't think human nature has changed at all since long before Galileo. I mean, we have a lot more technology, but as organisms, characters, we've really not changed. So there's always that problem. And today there's so much concern about science and religion still. So many books either in favor, books by scientists in favor of a religious outlook. I mean, certainly Galileo and Copernicus came to their work from a religious point of view. And Kepler was inspired to study the heavens to understand what God had meant. So obviously you can do real science with a belief in God. Nobody's questioning that. But a lot of, well, I shouldn't say nobody's questioning it. A lot of people are questioning it. And then we have scientists writing books saying that nobody should believe in God, that it's the most dangerous idea anyone has ever come up with. And I don't have any answer to that. I'm sorry. I hope you weren't expecting one. I can go only so far. I look at these things and I'm interested in the debate, but only to a degree. Yes? I'm not sure I am, no. Oh, no, I do know about that, yes. Yes, Rheticus wrote a defense of Copernicus, picking all the biblical quotations that might be used against him. So yes, they certainly did prepare for that. But I don't think the reason that Copernicus hesitated and shelved the manuscript was because he thought anything dangerous would happen to him. He knew he'd have to deal with what the Bible said, but Galileo faced the Inquisition. So the myth that Copernicus feared some kind of punishment from the church is what I meant. Yes. Bruno was burned at the stake, but Bruno was a real heretic, and his belief in the heliocentric universe was the least of the things he said. So I won't go along with you there. I don't think it was fear of right. Does Christ visit all these other worlds? How are we doing on time? You're standing up.
One more question. As a high school earth science teacher, I know the power that a good story has for my students, and I want to thank you for sharing some really good stories that I've been able to pass on to my own students.
Thank you.
But what I would like to hear from you briefly is, what do you see the role that the role of history has in a science classroom in helping students understand the nature of science?
What is the role of history in a science classroom? I think science very often is presented as this is what we know, without the this is why we know it, or this is how we came to know it. And so it has this air of a fait accompli. And I think people don't react well to that. Any people, not just students in an earth science class. And the stories make it come real for them. I don't know that you can always do that you can always present the science with the history, but it definitely helps. I mean, I said before that I didn't think people had changed much over the millennia, and the act of storytelling is an ancient part of human culture. So we learn things better when we learn them in stories. It's just the way it is. It's easier to grasp things that way. So when you can, it's fun to present it that way. I mean, I'm writing just a few books. If you have to teach a whole curriculum, it must be very hard to always get something that will keep their interest up. So I salute you.